So now I'm going to talk about expansionary and contractionary policy in macroeconomics. Now what I have here is three graphs. I've got the business cycle, which I'm going to draw, and then I've got an aggregate demand, aggregate supply model for each of expansionary and contractionary policy. So first I'll show when and why you would use these types of policy, and then I'll show you how it looks on the AD curve, and finally changes to CPI and GDP. Now, when we talk about expansion and contraction, we're talking about GDP. So we're expanding the economy and making GDP grow, or we're contracting the economy and GDP shrinks. Now, if you say, well, why would anybody ever want to shrink GDP? The answer is because inflation and GDP tend to go in opposite directions. If GDP is too high, inflation can be too high, and so by bringing GDP down, you can also bring inflation down. So that was the case maybe in the late 1990s, also in early 1980s. The Federal Reserve actually took activist policy, raising interest rates to lower inflation, but at the cost of bringing GDP down as well. So if you've ever seen the business cycle, GDP tends to move and fluctuate along this long-run growth rate. GDP rises over time, real GDP rises, but not at a continuous pace. So sometimes GDP is higher than it should be. Sometimes it is below the trend and lower than its long-run rate. So this is a time, if you ever learn the four phases, you would see that these are peaks. This is a trough, but the rising part is an expansion, and the dropping part here could be called a contraction or a recession. So those terms are sort of interchangeable, but GDP can go from a peak to start contracting, and then rising or expanding again, and then it goes into another contraction or recession. So one business cycle is the length between two peaks, but in between you have rises and falls. Now, I won't get into all the debate, what causes it, but I tend to look at expectations, maybe people over-purchasing, bubbles forming, although many other neoclassical economists would say that bubbles can't form if people are rational. But nonetheless, you can look at data, you can see there are recessions. Now, if GDP is below where it should be, you might want to try expansionary policy. And so the variables that usually matter are consumption, government expenditure, taxes, the money supply and interest rates, which tend to go together, and the exchange rate. What that will work through is, if you remember, y equals c plus I plus g plus x minus m, or net exports. So consumption, you can have autonomous consumption fueled through expectations, simple purchasing. You can have interest rates and money affect investment. The government acts on its own and can spend more, or a weaker currency. So more consumption, more money and lower interest rates, more government spending, or a weaker currency can expand the economy. So there are models that I'll show you in some other videos how that works, but that's generally how these variables affect. Also, I didn't mention a tax cut can work through consumption. It could be a social security tax cut or just an across-the-board tax cut. If taxes go down on consumers, then they spend more. So all of these variables will affect spending in a positive way. So keep that in mind. This is sort of on its own, but government spending and taxation can be classified under fiscal policy. Money supply and interest rates are monetary policy. And exchange rates I tend to call international policy. But a lot of times exchange rates are market-driven, but they can fall on their own. Or countries can actively pursue a fixed exchange rate, in which case they can set an exchange rate which is either higher or lower than the market would set it. So sometimes countries can have a weak currency to promote exports. So the exchange rate works through exports and imports. So these are the variables that we'll talk about in terms of fiscal, monetary, and international policy. But regardless of which one you use, because this adds up, it still moves the aggregate demand curve the same. So any one of these will move the AD curve in the same direction. So suppose that the money supply increases, or there's a tax cut. You can draw that as an increase in aggregate demand. So the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, and then you would see that there is a higher CPI. CPI goes up. At the same time, if you compare these two crossing points, GDP goes up. So there's higher inflation and higher growth simultaneously. So that's the trade-off policymakers face. If GDP is too low, then you can cause a little bit of inflation, but also cause GDP to grow and to create jobs. Likewise, a drop in consumption. So one thing people talk about is Black Friday, or the day after Thanksgiving. There's a bad shopping season, which is outside of government policy. But still, if consumers spend less, this could be contractionary on its own. Cutting government spending, raising taxes, cutting the money supply, or raising interest rates. So if there's a drop in consumption or government spending, a raise in taxes, a cut in the money supply or a raise in interest rates, or a appreciating currency, which doesn't really have an arrow because it depends on how you draw it, but an appreciating currency, all of these will have people buying less of our products or our country's products. So you can draw a contractionary policy like this. So if you look here, GDP goes down. So GDP will drop. And so that costs people jobs. But at the same time, even though there's higher unemployment, prices, or in my case, I usually say CPI, but it's more matches real life to say inflation. Inflation drops. So you can lower inflation by causing GDP to shrink. So contractionary policy does have a huge cost in terms of employment, but the benefit is lower inflation. So policymakers do pursue a low inflation policy at that cost. So that's the trade-off. You can create jobs and create inflation, or you can lower inflation but cost jobs. And so it's hard to do both through demand side policy. So all of these would be contractionary, and if you switch the arrows, you can have more consumption, more government, lower taxes, higher money supply, lower interest rate, and a depreciating currency. All of those would be expansionary. Now the last thing I'll say is this is the short run. What about the long run? Now, in a different video I say that if prices go up, then aggregate supply will shift left. Wages go up, intermediate goods costs go up. And if you draw this AS curve as a second shift, you can connect these two dots, and now you have the long run aggregate supply curve, which has even higher inflation. And in the long run, there's no increase in growth. This is a temporary boost in jobs, but then it goes back to normal. But the drawback is that there's high prices that last. So the classical model would say that this policy would actually only cause inflation and not help growth. Now, same thing is true here. You could say that the lower prices lead to more aggregate supply, and here you would the long run aggregate supply in the opposite direction. So you can temporarily contract the economy, but then it'll come back to where it started. So normally I focus on the short run, in which case contractionary policy raises GDP, but you can also say that in the long run, only prices are affected. So remember, it doesn't matter which it is, all of these move the aggregate demand curve the same way, provided that it increases spending by one group in the economy.